It.
Good afternoon, evening, or wherever the heck in the world you are. It is Monday, 10 a.m. on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And since it's that time, you guys know what time it is. It is time for London Paul to unleash the Sirius report. Guys, if you haven't done so already, I cannot emphasize how important it is that you go on the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS, SiriusReport.com, and subscribe to his premium member services. That is an intelligence briefing that you're getting every day with London Paul. It is the real news, the real information of what the hell's going on around the world, with the right kind of perspective of how it pertains to the much larger global events. Here's the deal: you're not going to get a global perspective out of CNBS or MSLSD or the Wall Street Journal or any one of these alt media guys that are out there who have no sort of finger to the pulse of what's happening internationally. You all that have been following this work from London Paul, as well as myself and a few others that you can count on one hand, know that the dollar dies abroad before it collapses here. So go to the SiriusReport.com, subscribe to the premium member services, and make it happen for less, $4.75 a month. That's less than the price of a latte at Starbucks. Make it happen, people. With that being said, London Paul, what's going on, buddy?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and how are you? You well?
I'm doing good, man. I'm still trying to formulate names for our upcoming boy band that we will be forming. You'll be
Well,
one of the lead vocals.
you'll be pleased to know I've managed to source us a 5-album deal. So
Good. I'm pretty sure you did. And I know you were discussing before we went on the air how you and I and CJ and Bix and all the rest of the guys, we're all going to be singing about the bad old days, right?
Yeah, we'll never want to let go of them.
Yeah. Oh, the bad old days. Because when it all gets good, we'll all be out of work. So
No, we'll
oh
just be able to
man,
talk about good things that are happening. It'll
that's
be a
it.
different way of dealing with things, but yeah, it'll be.
Exactly correct.
But
Where do you want to begin?
yeah,
I
so
mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I know you want to talk. You want to really focus on the U.S. domestically and
well, also
internationally.
a lot of yeah, but I think to preface this, for me, I think we talked about this. That there's no time scales. You'll keep seeing people saying, "Oh, something's going to happen next week, in 2 weeks, in a
Correct.
month. It'll be the summer. It'll be the autumn." There is no time scales. There never was, and there never will be.
Hmm.
Everything's kind of event-driven scenarios. Now, from my perspective, I think we're entering a new cycle of what I think. This is from the cabal deep state perspective, what you might term disruptive and destructive geopolitical events. But I thought what I'll do is I'll preface it first by saying, obviously, we had the phase after the 2008 economic crisis. Now, in the West, it was all QE, zero interest rate policy, cheap credit for bank, debt expansion, consumption-based economies, resource depletion, propping up the Western banks, seize control of more resources if they could, expand corporations who were just there to make massive profits. They didn't care about anything else. And then to expand the service-based economy on the back of that. So we had more and more low wages, zero contract hours, something that we've had a lot of experience in the UK alone. So, and then
Yeah.
you had the East with the birth of the BRICS, the creation of the AIIB, the extension and growth of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the new development bank, SIPs and mere payment systems, de-dollarization via bilateral trade, China and Russia the big exponent,
Right.
the East buying up huge quantities of gold and silver, the whole One Belt, One Road initiative backbone, the slow introduction of new technologies, true globalization, and true kind of free market economies. And then so that was all kind of born. And then we had the warfare, what I call like the full-on war phase. That was Syria because of the gas pipelines, via Qatar, which is why, Russia's sort of strangled that. Saud's now moving ever closer to victory. We had the engineered attempt via Ukraine to take down the Russian economy, socially, militarily, trying to stoke possibly World War III. That's failed. And of course, Ukraine's just now a failed state on every level. We saw recently how Mosul's fallen, and really, in essence, it's the end of the Daesh Caliphate in Iraq. In that period, we also in the warfare, we saw the birth of Daesh and the Islamic State. It's turned into a failed project in the Middle East. Okay, they're trying to export it elsewhere, of which there's no doubt. But I don't think it'll be to the same extent, but it doesn't mean there isn't a risk of kind of terrorist attacks and events happening. And in a way, the war phase also was the migration phase into Europe, where they wanted to flood Europe to create a lot of problems and effectively pitch person against person and create all manner of kind of ethnic strife across Europe. And they've tried to do it. And in some senses, that's starting to fail as well, because there's been a backlash in Europe where they're saying, we're not taking any more immigrants, particularly like nations like Poland, Hungary, and Turkey has sort of said we're not allowing any more to come through. And even now you're seeing in Italy where there's been that backlash. So we've kind of had that phase, and I thought something new is going to start happening, because they're never going to kind of give up. It doesn't mean they've got any strength to do anything in particular, but they won't give up easily. So I started to look for what I thought was what's like disruptive kind of geopolitical events and trying to be destructive. And we can talk about some of that in the respect of the US, which unfortunately they're getting sucked into, which Trump might be the president, but it's not Trump doing it. But obviously, moving of Daesh into new territories was a classic example of the problem. Now, if we look first in terms of the US internationally, an example recently is Washington's now planning to sell Taiwan about $1.5 billion in arms. Now, this includes all manner of torpedoes, and apparently, I don't know what anti-radiation missiles are, but they exist apparently. And these are ground missiles.
Yeah, anti-radiation missiles will be like missiles that are designed to take out radar installations. Like we have
okay, yeah.
Yeah, like the main one that we have is called HARM. It's a high-altitude anti-radiation missile, and that's basically what it is. It's a anti-radar missile. So to find out these radars and to kill them.
Okay, so I mean, historically, everyone knows that the tension between Taiwan and China sees it as the one China policy. So, of course, as soon as the US does this, what's the first thing? Chinese Foreign Ministry comes out and says, look, the United States is violating international rights. Because Taiwan is regarded from China's perspective as an inseparable part of China. So if you sell arms to Taiwan, the United States violates international rights and fundamental principles of foreign relations. Now, interestingly, of course, the State Department says, look, we might be selling arms, but we're not trying to make any changes to one China's policy, despite the fact we're selling arms to Taiwan. So the question is, well, why do they imagine that? Because they know it's going to inflame and antagonize the Chinese. But what's the reality? This is another example of this disruptive geopolitics. Why? Because by the US arming Taiwan, it's going to run roughshod over the dialogue that you're seeing between Taipei and Beijing. And it's only going to lead to an escalation of military political tension in the region. That's exactly what the cabal deep state want to do. That's what they do all over the world. So, and also from the deep state's perspective, the consolidation of Chinese Taiwanese economies doesn't fit into the unipolar world. It's the multipolar world, something they're adverse to. And of course, the problem you have is the timing, once again, is significant, because there's all these influential political groups in Taiwan who want to support the reunification with China in line with the Hong Kong kind of scenario, one country, two systems strategy. Well, this was starting to get a lot of gravity, and immediately what do we see? The US supplies arms to Taiwan that's going to impede that peaceful dialogue between Beijing and Taipei. And it will support the separatist forces viewpoint who wants Taiwanese independence. So once again, it's a desperate attempt by the cabal deep state to influence events in the Far East. Now, what's interesting is historically, and this is where it gets, for me, was even more interesting. The US always says that it doesn't see Taiwan, this is historically, as a sovereign nation, and it does officially stick to the one China policy, and it's maintained informal relations since they severed diplomatic ties back in the late 70s. I think it was 78 or 79.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is, and this is what started to rankle with the Chinese, was back in December before Trump was elected. he had a phone call with the Taiwan president, which of course Beijing took great offence at, because he became the first US president, or obviously in that case he was president-elect, to speak with a Taiwanese leader in an official capacity since, obviously, as we said, 1978-79, when the US effectively severed ties in that regard with the island nation. So there was already something simmering in the past. Now, the problem with this is, as much as we know Trump, I think Trump's been suckered into very bad advice in terms of foreign policy. Mm-hmm. I mean, going to sell arms to the Taiwanese is not the thing to be doing at this time. The US needs to be making friends with the Chinese and the Russians, not alienating them. But we can clearly see the reasons. It's this disruptive geopolitics. The deep state or the cabal are sat there going, hang on, things aren't quite working out how we wanted in the Far East. You know, North Korea seems to have gone on the back boiler, or people aren't really that bothered. Things seem to be calming down a bit. The Chinese and the Russians seem to be calming the issue. And we'll talk about South Korea in a minute, which is another example of this. And therefore they're going, right, well, we need to start stoking tensions. How can we do it? And this is exactly their game plan. It always has been. And unfortunately, the Trump administration's been sucked into this. Now, it's very naive for the State Department to seriously imagine that the Chinese don't see this as a problem, selling them arms. It's going to, I mean, imagine if somebody started selling arms to the Cubans.
Yeah.
The US aren't going to sit there and go, well, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about that. We don't have a problem. Of course, they're going to see it as antagonism. Now, when we look at South Korea, and we've spoken about this before, they obviously had this new president, Moon Jae-in, who was it was really not what Washington wanted to see. He was far more pro talking to North Korea, resolving tensions with China. Now, what happens? Trump meets Moon Jae-in, and all of a sudden, this guy's talking like he's a completely different person. He's now saying, well, we want to have joint US-Korean military drills. And he says...
We won't, or we want?
No, we want to. We want them. And he said it should be viewed separately from the North Korean nuclear question of the whole issue. Now, the point is, North Korea has said all along, and the Chinese have said all along, that as far as they're concerned, if you carry on with these drills, it's just enflaming the situation. And at the time, Moon Jae-in said, no, I agree. Now he's gone back on that. And he's also said that that North Korea could help restart bilateral talks by releasing US nationals. Now, I don't know how many US nationals are there, but once again, he's inflaming the situation, not resolving the situation. Now, we know with regards to THAAD that he put a hold on them. He was very reticent to have them and any more of these THAAD, deployments being put into South Korea. And now he's come out and he's had a go at China, as describing that they're trying to change his government's sovereign policy with regards to bringing US missiles and defense systems into the country. So it's another kind of complete 180. He's also said, look, I'm going to be sitting down at the G20 talking to Trump and the Japanese President Abe, or Prime Minister Abe, sorry, and you kind of get the feeling it's all going to be revolving around a very, how do I describe it? A completely inappropriate way of handling the North Korean situation. I don't think it's going to work out particularly well, and I think it's an extension of, we've got South Korea kind of back on side. Let's see if we can drag Abe back into the process.
Pretty interesting. The money powers and the corrupt generals that are in South Korea, they don't want to resolve the North Korean situation. That whole fear and specter keeps those idiots in power. Yeah, the only people that want to some sort of resolve this whole thing is the population. They're like, hey, let's just bury the hatchet here. Let's get back to reunification. But the North Korean power structure needs the South Koreans as the antagonists, and South Korean power structure needs the North Korean. I mean, they exist because how many bureaucracies and jobs and livelihoods have been created around the specter of northern conflict on the Korean Peninsula again. These guys, their whole job is to stay in power.
Yeah, and it's the way of giving the US legitimacy to be in the region at all.
Exactly.
So, I mean, there's a bit
CIA
of
state, just like what you said, Paul. Total CIA state.
Yeah, exactly. And the issue is, of course, they're saying, well, we want to have some discussion about high level consultation about sort of bilateral trade between the US and South Korea. But that's not really important. And what the problem is that the South Korean new president's getting sucked into this kind of old paradigm mentality of how we're going to deal with North Korea. And it's pretty obvious he must have had some pressure put on him, because he seems to have U-turned. Now, whether he's just U-turning it for the cameras and in reality he's gone away and said, no, we're not going to do that, we'll have to wait and see. But it's another example of this disruptive kind of geopolitical attempts to, again, destabilize the region. You've got Taiwan and you've got South Korea. I mean, who knows what attempts will be made with Japan, because certainly Japan and China in recent weeks and months have started to mend a lot of the old problems that they both experienced, which again was induced by the deep state cabal. They were the ones who caused the tensions between those two nations. Why? Because once again, it's divide and conquer. So this is these kind of disruptive geopolitical events. Then if you go back to Syria. Now, obviously, we know what the reality of what's going on in Syria with respect to the fact that pretty much Daesh is done now. Yeah, the war's not over, but so what do we see? And we have this telegraphed where the whole White House claim about the Syrian government was going to making preparations for chemical weapons attacks. Now, interestingly, Trump had a conversation with Macron, and the one thing Macron's kind of gets rather agitated about, if there's any chemical incidents or attacks in Syria, we're going to have to deal with it. Apparently, there must have been some conversation with the British Defence Secretary, because he's coming out saying we'll support any retaliation by the United States for the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Once again, it's this disruptive geopolitics. They know they've lost the war, so what are they trying to do? Create this illusion that Assad's going to launch chemical weapons against his own people, which of course Syria's condemned and said, this is absolute nonsense. We've got no intention of doing, we never have. And they made the point quite rightly that the legal process is, if a country suspects another country of planning a chemical attack, it needs to contact, this is the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And that's then supposed to send investigators. Now, Syria keeps saying, come out and investigate, and they won't. They've got no interest in doing so. Meanwhile, we still see this same idea that Syria is going to commit these chemical weapons attacks. Now, we know it hasn't happened, but Russian intelligence is saying, look, we're aware that there are plans for somebody to carry out a chemical attack, and they think it's Al-Nusra Front, although they've probably renamed themselves because they change their name every week, like there's some weird rebranding exercise. But it appears as though they might be trying some provocation using sarin gas in Syria. And ironically, it's supposed to be in the same location as that alleged attack that never happened on April the 4th in the vicinity of, it was in Khan Sheikhoun. So again, Russia's aware of it, has got the intelligence. There's no doubt that there is going to be somebody is probably going to try and launch a chemical attack. So therefore, it gives the pretext for the US to say, well, we need to go and deal with this matter. We're going to launch more missile attacks on the Syrian, or they may see it as an excuse to try and ramp up, and start to send troops. And I don't think anything like that's going to happen. But that's the mentality of the kind of cabal and this disruptive geopolitics, and we're seeing it globally where they're just doing everything they can to throw in the kitchen sink at trying to stoke up tensions in the hope that somewhere someone will bite and make a mistake, and it can try and readdress the balance of power, say in Syria, for example, as deluded as that might be. But that's how desperate they are. And that's why, for me, we've moved into this whole new phase of operations. It might also explain why we keep seeing these strange stray missiles coming over from Syria that land in no man's land in Israel,
and then
Israel responds. And you think, really, how many times has this got to happen before someone wakes up and realizes what's really going on? It's more of this disruptive politics that's going, geopolitical events, and an attempt just to destabilize whatever, in the case of Syria, in this case, and to give Israel provocation. I mean, you just wonder at some point, is there going to be an attempt to try and accuse Hezbollah of doing something? You just don't know, but that's the level of desperation. So as much, again, as we've said many times, the cabal is extremely weak and they're effectively have lost the war. They've tried anything to destabilize regions. And if this is in terms of militarily in the Middle East, or in terms of militarily also in the Far East, but also they want to disrupt nations who they feel might start to latch on and key nations in terms of the multipolar world. I think they've given up on Turkey. They realise they've got no chance. They've made the fatal mistake of trying to kill Erdogan, which really was, if they had any chance of turning him back towards the unipolar world, they failed miserably in trying to do so. Thanks to the Russians again, who obviously alerted him to that fact. But I think this is just another example.
We've seen the fruits of that when artillery was opened up on U.S.-backed Kurdish forces in northern Syria by the Turks.
Yes, exactly, and that there's a whole simmering war going on there, which really could turn extremely ugly because you're going to have a civil war effectively inside Syria.
Yeah,
which is quite unbelievable in terms of the context of what that. I mean, and also you're going to get the US caught in the middle of that by the fact of their support for the Kurds. So yeah, without a doubt, and the whole Turk Stream gas pipeline coming back online, or actually coming online, or the construction of it, they've lost Turkey effectively.
yeah.
And I guess in a way we have to mention Qatar. Now Qatar's kind of, I know you mentioned it earlier, so I won't try and go through too much with regards to that. But the interesting point regarding Qatar obviously was the fact that the Qatari said, look, can we have another 2 days in terms of providing a response to you regarding your 13-point demands, and the Kuwaitis actually received the 13-point demands today, and who are then presumably going to hand it over and have a discussion with the Saudis, the Bahrainians and the Egyptians and the UAE. But Qatar's made it quite clear, we'll defend our country at all costs. We're not going to sacrifice our sovereignty. We hope it doesn't come to this, but if there's military intervention, there's military intervention. Now, what's interesting is, and of all, you wouldn't have necessarily expected this, but Petraeus, who was obviously a former CIA director, he said that he actually came out and said that Qatar's hosted delegations from both Hamas and the Taliban at the request of the US.
Huh.
He just came out with this as a matter of fact, and he said, our partners should remember that Qatar, at our request, welcomed delegations from the Taliban and Hamas, and that Qatar is now home to our military headquarters for our operations throughout the Middle East. I mean,
you can't make this stuff up, Paul. You really can't.
I mean, I don't know what his motivation for doing this is, but not only has he implicated the US, but I mean, I don't think he's done himself any favors. But I think this is, again, these people are sort of terrified that they're going to get caught up and implicated in things. So they're just shouting their mouth off and admitting the reality of what's going on. Now, the situation in the US is in a very difficult position, because if it kind of stokes things up too much, this is why I think it's been neutral, and it sets off a military confrontation. They know full well that the Saudis are going to get annihilated. I mean, there's no doubt. I think you're talking a matter of weeks before the war's over between the Qataris and the Saudis, simply because they'll have the Iranian and the Turkish forces backing them. So, and then the issue is, well, if the Saudis lose, what does that mean for the petrodollar? And as it is, well, you know, eventually it's going to obviously eviscerate. Now, the problem you also have is, and this is the reality, the Qataris have been doing, and this is really, it always comes back to, all states can do what the hell they like. They can murder all their people, they can rape and pillage their nation in every manner, speaking, economically, socially, politically. But as soon as you start dumping dollars or trading in non-dollar terms, then something has to happen. Of course, the Qataris have been trading in tens of billions of well, not dollars, Chinese yuan. So this explains why the fear factor is, well, if we don't do something to Qatar, they may destroy the petrodollar. So this is why the US is sat there rather nervously going, and that's why they're not being, this disruptive geopolitics isn't really happening in the Middle East with respect to Qatar, because they're kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't. Yeah. They're likely that the petrodollar is going to die, and whether they don't do anything with regards to Saudi or do something. And also because, of course, before any conflict even starts, they know full well that they've got the Iranians and Turkish backing. So I think that's why, I no doubt at some point the whole thing with Qatar was was trying to be another disruptive geopolitical event, thinking, oh, the Qataris will just roll over and back down and say, terribly sorry, we'll start trading in dollars again, we'll start behaving ourselves, and we'll agree to your demands and become a kind of an annex of Saudi Arabia. And they actually, I think, genuinely thought that that was a reality. Well, of course, it's not a reality. It's not going to happen.
I mean, the Saudis really have this skewed view of themselves. They really do. They think they can do anything. It's it's laughable.
Well, it is, but I think that's unfortunately that's something with the US cabal and the deep state. They think the same. They have this arrogance that they can still stomp around the world and dictate to nations, and nations are just going to roll over and do as they say, and that's of course is not worked out. And the recent moves in the Far East to do with the Korean Peninsula is something. That's why they're acting quickly, and unfortunately, the Trump foreign policy makers or whoever's coming out with the statements is doing it intentionally, because there can't be on any level that someone would sit there and go, this is a really strong geopolitical move for us to undertake in the Far East. It just makes absolutely no sense. But so I think, in a sense, that's the US foreign policy and it's making some serious mistakes in terms of how it's going to impact the US. And in terms of domestically, I mean, you mentioned Illinois, and it's worth mentioning it again, is the fact, really, Illinois as a state is a blueprint for what's going to happen to multiple states in the US in the foreseeable future, and maybe not that foreseeable. I mean, and there was an extra bit of context where apparently just hours before they had this deadline to pass a budget, apparently the federal judge in Chicago ordered Illinois to come up with hundreds of millions of dollars it owed in Medicaid payments that the state officials say the government doesn't have. Well, there's a surprise. So he ordered the state to make something like 550 to 600 million in monthly payments, when currently it's about 160 million. And then there's another 2 billion towards a 3 billion backlog of payments. And the reality is, of course, the bond markets would have been in chaos come today, and they'd have downgraded Illinois' bonds to junk. But what actually ended up happening is, apparently late on Sunday, and you referenced this, where they announced this income tax raise by 32% from 3.75 to 4.9%, and this corporation income tax rise from 5.25 to 7%. Now, you point out quite rightly, it's absolutely insane. What you do, the last thing you do is raise income taxes like that, because all you're going to do is cause a mass exodus out of Illinois. Right. And apparently there's also court orders that essentially requires Illinois to divert almost its entire operating budget to pay outstanding bills. So, I mean, basically it's just trying to pay its debt off. It's going to raise these income tax raises, just suicide. And the reality is they actually probably had to double the income tax rate just to get anything close to balancing their budget, which shows just what a mess they're in. I mean, I think at these levels, they're probably going to still have probably at least 15 to 20 billion in unpaid operating bills, and they've still got this 250 billion unfunded pension liability. Illinois is going to lose businesses and a decreasing population. Well, guess what? If you start hiking taxes, you're going to cause more businesses to move and an even more decreasing population. So in essence, what Illinois sort of unfortunately proves out, it's absolutely bankrupt. Yeah, they'll try and kick the can down the road and think that people will think this is a viable solution, and it isn't. It's unfixable, and in essence, it's kind of a poster child for the absolute insane failed policies of the cabal deep state in terms of what they've done to the US. And in essence, it's like the implosion. Each state's the implosion of part of their empire. It's very sad for the people in the state, but it's also kind of dangerous in a way in terms of what it's going to do in the immediate future for US state. Now, unfortunately, the insane policy, and it partly feeds back into the old QE zero interest rate policy and everything else that came after 2008. They've wrecked all these states across the US, and in essence, every state and city and municipality across the whole of the US effectively became almost like corporations. So just like the federal government. So therefore, they stop the laws of what should be the US Republic stopped applying to them. So therefore, they're able to just the cabal deep state were able to just ground each of these states into the ground by exactly the same process that they've ground the whole US economy in terms of central bank policy in the process. So it's worth mentioning that, I mean, Illinois is not going to be a unique example. But once again, we talk about how long things are going to take to effectively implode. And it's another example, effectively, with these tax hikes. They think, oh, we'll be able to fudge the balance sheet somehow. We'll make things look better in the short term. We'll just kick the can down the road for a while. But ultimately, the real economy is killing everything. And it's a slow death process. And why anyone who thinks things are going to be resolved in 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever, is being misled. And those people who continue saying it are really not doing people any favors whatsoever, because they're mismanaging people's expectation that somehow magically things can be repaired. The trouble is, and it's the same for Western Europe, but maybe not to the same extent, just by the size of nations. And in terms of the UK's population, 60 million, and it doesn't have quite the problems obviously the US has, but it does have economic and social and political problems of that, there's no doubt. And it's the same across all the European nations who've adopted the QE zero interest rate policy, which has wrecked and destroyed economies. But it's worth mentioning Illinois simply on the basis that you can guarantee when's the next. I mean, there's rumours about Maine and countless other states that are going to suffer a similar fate, and there's no way around this. This is economic reality that's killing the illusion that they've created, that the American, unfortunately, too many American people still believe to be true. And in that sense, it's worth mentioning that aspect of what's going on with the US. And it's interesting, and I'm not a big fan of the International Monetary Fund, but even they've started to go, do you know what? We're looking at Trump's administration's kind of tax cuts and fiscal spending plans, although the details not exactly there, and they've cut the US economic growth to around 2% for this year and next year, where previously, and they basically said, look, even worse, we can see that you're never going to get annual growth of over 3%, because the whole basis is they're saying, well, the labour market's already at a level with full unemployment, even though we know probably 30% of people in the US are unemployed, and there's over 100 million economically inactive people. But right. These projections show that you're not, how are you going to finance your expected tax cuts and the new federal spending? There's no indication of that. So they're realizing there's big holes in the whole process of how Trump's going to manage the economy going forward. Now, I'm not a big fan of the IMF, as I said, but in some senses, what they're saying is true. But that's because the US, the real GDP growth has been negative. It's probably every year 3 and 4% higher what they publish than reality.
Yeah.
So it's an impossibility. Now, what's not going to help the US is in terms of its fiscal spending policies. The US needs to bring in a huge amount of money. We know, we've talked about this before, its infrastructure's in serious disrepair. Now, the one nation that particularly could probably assist the US more than anyone is China. Well, the problem is, the last thing you can do to China is go, well, do you know what? I'm just going to start selling missiles to the Taiwanese. I'm going to start upsetting the South Koreans and making them think, we may need to start taking military action against the North Korea. You just don't do that, because the US needs China, as well as being its biggest creditor in the world. It's the one that has the opportunity to, in essence, if the US sat down with the Chinese and said, look, I know we're not part of your Belt and Road map in terms of helping underdeveloped countries, but you know what? Let's find a way where you can help us reinvigorate our infrastructure, rebuild our nation, attract Chinese businesses into the UK and stimulate the heartbeat of the economy again. Then Trump's economics, or what he's been advised as being 3% growth, maybe that starts to become a reality. But at the moment, there is no reality to it. And that's something that he's been badly advised on as well. And there might be reasons why certain people want to prop up the illusion of the US economy. But the reality is there's no 3% growth coming anytime soon. And therefore, that puts his whole tax and spending plans completely on its head. And that for me is another kind of major problem. we've also seen, I mean, and in simple terms, and the UK is exactly the same. I mean, the Pentagon has apparently for it's in terms of managing and balancing its budget, it has failed to do so for 87 out of the last 120 months reported. So clearly completely overspending, and no one's actually looking at them spending 46 billion in the last fiscal year and what's it been spent on and where's the money going, and there's no desire to look at that aspect. And it's the same. The problem is there's huge wastage of money in that regard across Europe as well in terms of spending plan. And then we also see in terms of the US that we know that in terms of gold reserves and all the gold's heading east, but the US has been selling a huge amount of gold in the first 4 months of this year. I mean, it was something like 170 metric tons compared last year to 120 metric tons. So it's gone up, what, 40 odd %. Now, the question
is U.S. selling gold, right? You said?
Yeah, this is the US exporting gold. Yeah. Now, this is a huge increase. And also, interestingly, we're starting to see that US sales of, or domestic sales of gold seems to have fallen off a cliff edge as well in the first half of this year. Now, the question is, why is the US selling all its gold? Well, it might be in part because they still owe gold from botched deals in the past where the Chinese were owed a lot of gold and demanded it and they're having to give it back to them. But it's also a sign of extreme weakness in the economy that they're just dumping all the gold instead of realizing we need to keep hold of it.
Yeah.
And
it just shows you I mean, getting rid of all this gold also shows you that the banksters are still alive and well within the whole system.
Yes, and it doesn't mean it's. I mean, when you say that, people tend to get fearful and think it means they're still in control. Yeah, they're in control of a paper illusion, and
Correct.
We've seen only this week how they've smashed gold and silver prices down again on the basis of nothing. I mean, I don't know what it is now, but earlier on, silver was down 2% on the day, and I think gold was back at 12.30. So there's a real desire from the paper market side of things to smash price. And of course, what that does is it creates the illusion in the minds of people in the West that, well, this isn't an asset worth investing in because the price is falling, and they get all the illusion. Well, why is the US selling all the gold? Why is all the gold heading east? More fool them for buying it. But yeah, in a sense, it's just the whole paper Ponzi illusion is still. It's alive, but it's only alive on the basis of till the real economy and reality hits home and destroys the illusion, and the illusion is rapidly disintegrating, as Illinois proves. I mean, you're only going to need a few more Illinois, and then very soon people in the US are going to go, hang on, you're telling us unemployment's at 4.5%. Telling us there's strong, the economy's strong enough for us to raise interest rates. I mean, that's the whole basic. You only raise interest rates when your economy's overheating. Now, on what level have they managed to fool anybody into believing that the US economy's overheating? When all the true economic stats proves to the contrary, even though that's all completely ignored. But ultimately, that doesn't matter. That economic reality wins out. The paper illusion will carry on, and it'll probably carry on till the day when it will just implode on itself, and economic reality will hit home, and that's why if you're interested in buying silver and gold, I wouldn't worry about the price. It's an irrelevance. It's just paper manipulation. Physical uptake in the world, it may be declining a bit in the Western nations, but the East continues to buy, and if the price falls to 1230, the East is going to say, well, bring it on, we'll buy even more, sell us everything you've got. But it's not a great sign from a US standpoint that it's dumping that much gold. And it doesn't seem to have any buyers inside its own nation. And I suppose gold producers are going to sell them to whoever they can sell it to. But if there's no demand inside the US, it doesn't bode well when every other nation's preparing for a future where gold-backed currencies, whether people agree with it or don't agree with it, that's the reality. That's where we're going to. So it's another example of the major problems you're seeing in terms of the US and its real economy. And it all just goes back to my very first statement about QE's zero interest rate policy, cheap credit, and debt expansion. That was the illusion, and the illusion now is feeding economic reality and destroying everything in its path. And there is no difference. It's the same to a lesser extent in the UK. The only difference is we don't have the reserve currency of the world, which just exacerbates the problem 50, 100-fold.
Correct. Absolutely, man. We are still broken economically, and unless we get those things, those rudiments that make a functioning economy, especially with the whole new world that's being set up, that's the multipolar world. It's already here, Paul. The multipolar world is already here. It's already being, it's formed, and now it's just maturing right now. But it's definitely here. Unless we get our act together, we're going to be on the outside looking in.
Well, do you know what? The UK falls exactly into that same window of opportunity. That we've got the whole Brexit thing, and that's going to and fro, and Europe's kind of realizing now. Do you know what? Actually, it's not quite so simple, because when the UK pulls out, we're going to be $20 billion equivalent worse off every year, because the UK has been a net contributor to the European Union since its inception, which a lot of people may not be aware of. So the UK pulls out. They're also starting to realise that on the basis of that, what's that going to do to our economies? Where are we going to plug the gap? I mean, how do you raise 20 billion? Where's it going to come from? So it's not a simple question of the European Union trying to dictate to the UK. The UK has a great opportunity, but at the moment it's not grasping that opportunity. You don't see it talking. I mean, yeah, they've talked to the Chinese a little bit, and they've nibbled at the edges of what the potential is, but they're going to have to start to take it seriously and deal with it. And the UK is as equally as guilty as the US. The only difference is, that Trump really does want to develop relations with them both, but he's been stymied and stifled by this destructive foreign policy, which, the reality is, until the US kind of really want to deal with this head on, the Chinese and the Russians are just going to stand back and say, do you know what? We're not really that interested. I mean, Lisa wrote an article and put it on our website earlier, which was, she basically said, the Kremlin's indifference to the US is becoming more apparent, and they're supposed to meet at the G20 with Trump and Putin, and you can see that the Russians are saying, you know what, well, we're kind of, well, yeah, we'll meet you, but you would have thought the very first thing when you were organising your itinerary for the G20, you'd sit there and say, well, I think we ought to meet Donald Trump. This is really important. Let's get on the phone to him and slot him in, in the first slot. They haven't even, at this stage, found a slot to have any discussions. It doesn't really. I mean, Trump seems very enthusiastic, but the Kremlin just is going, you know what? Well, we might meet you, but if we don't, well, who cares? And it's not because they don't think that Trump's sincere in the reality of what he wants to do. They just realise talking to him at this stage is not really going to foment any kind of change in US policy. They know that there's a problems with this rabid Russophobic kind of attitude about things that has worn off slightly, because the media have had a heck of a nosebleed over the bullshit they've been talking about, and CNN being an example of that. And the issue is, though, they just don't really see the US at the moment in a position to have any really constructive dialogue. I mean, they're not really offending the Russians in terms of foreign policy, but the Russians and the Chinese are joined at the hip, and the Chinese are going, well, do you know what? They're meddling in the Middle East. Someone's meddling in the Middle East from the US administration, and they're not very happy about it. So equally, they're supposed to have talks with the Chinese and the US, but what are those conversations going to be? Very muted, and it's not really working positively. And the Trump's main aim, I know, it's to take the wrecking ball to the and he's taken the wrecking ball to mainstream media, and we all applaud that, because that's one of the most divisive vehicles for basically frustrating people's opportunity to know the truth, and the propaganda and the manipulation of public opinion. But the big priority, and you've said it, we've discussed this before, is to turn the oil tank around in the US and rebuild the US economy, make it strong, make it vibrant as quick as possible. Now, 6 months into his administration, we're not seeing any evidence of that. I mean, The great example was, I think, Ford, who pulled out of Mexico and said, yeah, no, don't worry, we're not going to build it. What are they doing? They're not going to build a plant in China.
Yep.
I mean, that's not exactly glowing testimony to Trump's idea that, we're going to keep jobs inside the US. And the other problem you've got is, of course, is that other nations are now starting to talk like to the Mexicans, and who is it? Well, no surprise, China. And the Chinese will go, you know what, we will take advantage of the fact that you're not showing any real interest in trying to resolve the NAFTA problems. And I do agree it was a very bad trade deal, as all trade deals are, and there needed to be some resolution. But there's no real resolve at the moment to solve the real problems. And I think that's where the focal point's gone, and it's undoubtedly it's intentional. They want to switch the focus. The cabal's methodology has always been, let's switch the focus from internal politics, make the US all about international policy. That's where we want to be, because that's our greatest opportunity for stimulating growth in inverted commas in the US economy by waging wars, going around the world stealing other people's assets in the process, and siphoning all the resources out of economies. They've never, when did the US, when did we last see a US government seriously sit down and go, do you know what, let's resolve the internal economic, social problems. Let's rebuild America as it should be and make it, the great nation amongst equals that should be the aim. We've not seen it. And Trump's tried to do it, but it's very muted. And I think that's intentional. And they've sidetracked him away from that because he's not really talking about that particularly much. It's all what's going on in the world. Let's talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about Russia. Let's talk about the Far East and North Korea and China. And it's, once again, it all revolves, and we come back to this point, it's this disruptive geopolitical kind of phase of this event-driven scenario that we've moved into. And it's not going to yield any particularly negative results, but it's going to, globally that is, but I think from the US standpoint, it's going to stymie the US's attempts to resolve the internal problems it needs to. And whilst you're focusing on the likes of these other nations, you've got Illinois, it's like Rome's burning and everyone's ignoring it. Well, Illinois is burning in inverted commas. And what's being done to resolve the problem? Well, nothing. They've just kicked the can down the road. And in fact, they've just made the problem a million times worse by raising taxes, which is only going to end up causing Illinois to implode even worse than it would have imploded if they'd actually had a more sort of structured approach to resolving the problems.
It's funny, Paul. It's like these statists always forget one thing. Number one, they're not gods. Number two, they always ignore the most basic premise of economics, which is, Gresham's law. Money or capital goes where it's treated well. That's it. It's as simple as that.
Absolutely.
It's unreal.
No, it's very true, but it's worth actually. Something we're going to mention, which is not really, it relates to the US in terms of the NSA, but it relates more to Germany. But it gives a kind of insight to how internal politics in a nature completely and utterly destroys the whole purpose. We had the whole NSA in Germany thing where I think Merkel said, well, it's a bit much that our allies are spying on us. Now, Germany's recently had this 3-year investigation, and it's presented its findings to the German Parliament, the Bundestag. And basically, this report's 1,800 pages long, and it says absolutely nothing of substance in it whatsoever. And which probably isn't entirely surprising, but where it does get surprising is the fact it's kind of watered down, and there's almost this idea, well, there's all this consensus between the Germany and the US in how we handle problems in this regard, and there isn't any problem, there isn't any issues, as though it's been completely blown out of proportion. And then you start to find out that this report's been watered down because internally within the German political system, there's all this huge infighting going on, where most of them don't want the truth coming out. You've got all these redactions outside the report that certain minor political parties are saying that in reality, hang on a minute, there's some major major problems to do with criticism and recommendations regarding German intelligence services, how they should, report to external and parliamentary oversight. There's issues with the security around IT security, and they want an end to this, what they say is a secret war in, from, and within Germany. And there's German facilities that are not permitted to play roles in drone warfare that violates international law. Hang on, this is going on in our country. And this is the problem, where as much as someone goes away and says, write a report about this, it's even within the political system, it's all watered down to hide the truth and the reality of people as to what's going on. So someone's done a huge amount of work, presented all the evidence, which clearly shows there's huge deficiencies in terms of German intelligence services, how the Germans handle the risk of being spied on, whether it's the NSA or anyone else. No criticism of the US government or the German government, for that matter, in this process. But it just clearly, exemplifies the problems that even within the political system, you've got minor parties going, hang on, get the truth out, put it all out there, and then the rest of the political parties gang up on them and say, no, this is what's going out, and it's all watered down, and it all looks like it's a non-issue. And this is why, even at this point in time, even though we're going through this huge seismic kind of geopolitical change, you're seeing that the old problems inside the governments and the political machinery in country is still thwarting a lot of the reality of what should come out. And for these smaller parties to come out, I think it was they call the Left Party and the Greens in Germany, who saw the situation entirely different and want to, and said, that all the official reports basically are farce, and there's a huge amount of information that should be presented and isn't. Apart from them, the rest of them are all, and these are even political parties who don't like each other. They're fighting effectively in the next German elections that to gain governance with Germany. I mean, okay, it's very unlikely that Merkel will probably be re-elected, but that's not the point. On one level, they're pretending to create this illusion of fighting each other politically to form the next German government. And in the next breath, they're colluding to almost pervert the reality of what's going on with the German and the US governments, the intelligence agency, and the NSA spy. And this is why even when we get rid of a cabal from the world entirety, the whole political system also has to change, because you're not going to get rid of this problem. These kind of protectionist mentality means the whole political system has to be turned on its head. And as much as I despise party politics, it's all divisive, it's all an illusion. Well, still, whether people like it or not, you're going to have some form of governance in a country. Otherwise, if there's no structure, the country will collapse. Whether people think we can all live and in self-sustaining lifestyles and not have to have any governance, is just not possible. The problem isn't governance. The problem is how governance is carried out. You can have it done in a much more methodical, much more intelligent way that works for the people. But the problem is, how do you resolve the problems within these political systems? I mean, what you do, get rid of all these German parliamentarians and say we're going to have a whole bunch of new people, and it's going to take years to be able to weed the political systems of country away from this mentality and have them working for the betterment of people. So once again, this is another reason why for us to get to the new paradigm in totality takes a long time. It's not going to happen overnight, because you're still going to have these problems within the governance that's not going to go away for many years to come. And then, of course, the other problem within the current political system is who's looking after who's back, who's actually compromised in the governance sense, and who isn't. I mean, the US is a great example where you can't buy Trump because Trump can't be bought off. We know that. He's self-made billionaire. You can't. But are the people in his administration who have been bought off, have they been compromised? In which case, they're going to influence his political decisions. So you might not be able to influence him directly, but you can influence him indirectly. And that's another aspect and a problem that thwarts our ability to move, more expediently towards the future and where we want to be.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Paul, we're coming down to the end of the program, man. Give out your last thoughts, your closing comments, as well as how people could follow you and your website and all the other information.
Okay, well, my closing thoughts are, yeah, we're moving into this kind of disruptive geopolitical kind of event, so that, in this event-driven scenario, and I think we're likely to see more of this happening. I mean, it doesn't mean that nations like Russia, China are going to tolerate it lying down and do nothing about it, and unfortunately, the US is likely to be the nation that's going to go out there and do this unwittingly from a Trump administration. But I think that's something we need to be aware of. It'd be interesting to see what comes out of the whole Qatar Saudi thing when the Saudis have read the 13 points and realised that Qatar's not going to agree to it. That's going to be so that's something we can also pay attention to in the short term. And in terms of, we've got obviously the website, the SiriusReport.com, and V very kindly plugged our premium podcast service. I don't think I need to say any more. We're very grateful that he views it that way. We feel the same. We think it's very good value for money, and at $4.75 or equivalent a month, I think it's very good value for money. We've obviously got the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We've now actually sort of now got this Sirius Report page on Facebook. We're going to close down the group in a few weeks. It doesn't really serve any purpose, and I think the page works far better, and that's the way forward for now. I know some people don't use Facebook, and I appreciate that, but it's the amount of time we have available we have to work on in terms of priorities, so we can't have other forums that people might want to use in that regard. And obviously, thank you very much to Rogue Money for having us on, and we really enjoy doing this every week. And it is, at the end of the day, it's about the truth, and the truth and reality might not be what everyone wants to hear, but there's no point burying our head in the sand and pretending otherwise. We have to just accept that our reality is it is a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. And if you keep reading articles going that there's something amazing is going to happen in a day or a week, some of these people have been saying this for years, repeatedly, and nothing ever changes. So eventually you have to reach the point and ask yourself, well, how much longer can I take this as being credible and a reality if it doesn't happen? I mean, you keep saying something's going to happen and it doesn't, then whatever the person's suggesting probably in reality is never going to happen. Now, so we deal with the realities. Rogue Money deals with the realities. It can be a bit harsh, but don't get despondent, because if you're going to take a wrecking ball to a system that controlled 7 billion people, effectively, although increasingly not so, and in diminishing amount, you don't resolve it overnight. It's like a million pieces of string all raveled together, and you've got to pick each one out individually to resolve the problem. That takes a long time and a lot of concerted effort, and that's exactly what the East's trying to do, and why after 2008 they decided to work towards a better world, and that's what they're doing. But it just takes time to get the rest of the world to go along with you. And the UK and the US are great examples of nations that are going to just one day have to wake up and realize this can carry on no more, and the nonsense and the lies and the propaganda and the subversion of nations all has to end. But it takes time, and who knows, it might take the US and the UK too much time to come to the realization that those changes are coming, and they're going to have to embrace them, whether they like it or not.
Yeah, agree wholeheartedly. Paul, thank you so much for being on, man, and sharing all your thoughts with us. We look forward to next week, where you can join us again. I'm sure there's always going to be things to talk about, and I don't think we have to form our boy band. I think there's always going to
be yeah, not for now anyway.
Not for now. Oh, man. Thank you all for listening in, and have yourselves a great week. Take it away, CJ.